This arrogant millionaire thought he'd found easy entertainment, humiliating a tired waitress by making her play piano in front of everyone. He expected failure. He expected embarrassment. What he got instead was 3 minutes that revealed he just mocked one of the greatest pianists the world had ever seen. The crystal chandeliers of Giovanni's cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as Margaret wiped down table 14 for the third time that evening. Her fingers ached from the double shift, but she needed every dollar to keep her daughter in school. At 62, working as a waitress wasn't her dream, but life had dealt her different cards. "You there, waitress?" A booming voice shattered the restaurant's elegant atmosphere. Margaret turned to see Vincent Caldwell, a real estate mogul whose face regularly appeared in the business section. He sat with 3 colleagues, all wearing tailored suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement as he gestured toward the grand piano, sitting majestically in the corner. "I hear you people have natural rhythm," Vincent sneered, loud enough for nearby tables to turn. "That piano's been sitting there and used all night. Why don't you entertain us? Play something soulful." His friends erupted in laughter. Margaret's cheeks burned as every eye in the restaurant fixed on her. The manager, Paolo, approached nervously, caught between defending his employee and losing a wealthy patron who spent thousands monthly. "Sir, perhaps," Paolo began. "What's wrong? She too good to play for us." Vincent pulled out his wallet, tossing $100 bills on the table. "Here's 500. Surely that's more than she makes in tips all week. Go on, play us a tune." The other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young couple at table 7 looked down at their plates, embarrassed to witness such cruelty. An older woman near the window shook her head in disgust, but said nothing. The sommelier froze mid-pour, his bottle of Bordeaux hovering awkwardly above a crystal glass. Margaret felt her throat tighten. She'd endured countless indignities during her years in service. Rude customers, unfair complaints, people snapping their fingers at her like she was invisible. But this felt different. This wasn't just disrespect. It was deliberate humiliation, performed as entertainment for his business associates. Vincent leaned forward, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you don't actually know how to play. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Probably just another lie on your resume to get this job." One of his colleagues, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, chuckled nervously and added, "Come on, Vincent. Maybe we should just—" "Nonsense," Vincent interrupted, slapping the table. "I'm offering good money here. More than fair for a little entertainment. Unless she's too proud? Is that it? Too proud to earn an honest $500. Paolo wrung his hands, his face flushed. He caught Margaret's eye and gave her an apologetic look that said everything. He couldn't afford to lose Vincent's business, not with the restaurant barely recovering from the previous year's losses. Margaret had worked at Giovanni's long enough to know the financial struggles, the late-night conversations she'd overheard between Paolo and his wife about making ends meet. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive. Even the kitchen's sound seemed to fade away. The clinking of silverware stopped. The murmur of conversation died. Every person in that restaurant was now watching this awful moment unfold, wondering what would happen next. Vincent's smile grew wider, more vicious. He mistook her silence for defeat. "That's what I thought. All talk, no action. Typical. You know what? Forget the piano. Just bring us our check. And maybe next time, don't waste our time pretending you're something you're not." His words hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Not her spirit breaking, but something else. Something that had been locked away for 15 years was suddenly demanding to be released. Her hands, which had been trembling moments before, grew steady. Her breathing slowed. A strange calm washed over her. She looked at Vincent Caldwell with his perfectly groomed hair, his expensive watch, his assumption that money and power gave him the right to treat people as props in his personal theater of cruelty. And in that moment, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her serving tray. Every instinct screamed to walk away, to preserve whatever dignity remained. But something stirred deep within her, memories of another life, another version of herself that this arrogant man knew nothing about. "I'll play," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside. Vincent leaned back triumphantly, swirling his wine. "Finally, some entertainment with our overpriced pasta." Margaret set down her tray and walked toward the piano with slow, deliberate steps. Her orthopedic shoes squeaked slightly against the polished floor. She could feel the weight of every stare, hear the whispered conversations, sense the pity mixed with curiosity. As she reached the bench, she removed her apron with trembling fingers. For a moment, she simply sat there, staring at the ivory keys that seemed to glow under the soft lighting. It had been so long, 15 years since her fingers had touched a piano, not since the accident that shattered her wrist and ended her career, not since medical bills had consumed everything and forced her into this life of service. But muscle memory, she discovered, never truly dies. She adjusted the bench, her movements slow and deliberate. The leather cushion was worn smooth from years of use, and as she settled onto it, a wave of nostalgia crashed over her. How many piano benches had she sat on throughout her life? Hundreds? Thousands? In practice rooms and concert halls, in her childhood home and her teacher's studio, under hot stage lights, and in quiet corners of her own apartment. Her right wrist ached. It always did when the weather changed, a permanent reminder of that rainy night when everything fell apart. She flexed her fingers experimentally, watching them move. The scar tissue beneath her skin pulled slightly, but the fingers obeyed. They were older now, the joints swollen with arthritis, the skin spotted and creased, but they still remembered. Behind her, Vincent whispered something to his colleagues that provoked muffled laughter. She heard the word disaster and embarrassing. He was already preparing his next round of mockery, already composing the story he'd tell at his club about the delusional old waitress who thought she could play piano. Margaret closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The restaurant smelled of garlic and fresh bread, of expensive wine and wood polish. But in her mind, she was somewhere else entirely. She was 23 again, walking onto the stage at the Moscow Conservatory, her heart pounding as she prepared to perform for Dmitri Bashkirov himself. She was 35, recording her first album, the weight of headphones pressing against her ears as she played take after take until perfection emerged. She was 47, the last night before the accident, playing Liszt's Transcendental Etudes in a small venue in Boston, unaware that her life was about to shatter like glass. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and for a terrifying moment, she wondered if she'd forgotten everything. What if the magic was truly gone? What if 15 years of absence had erased what decades of training had built? What if Vincent was right to mock her, and she was just a foolish old woman clinging to a past that no longer existed. Then her index finger touched middle C, and the notes sang out pure and clear. The sound traveled through her finger, up her arm, and straight into her heart. It was like greeting an old friend after years of separation. The joy of recognition, the bittersweet ache of time lost, the gratitude that the connection still existed. She pressed another key, then another. A simple scale, C major, the first thing every piano student learns. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, testing, remembering, awakening. The arthritis complained, but didn't stop her. The scar tissue pulled, but didn't break her. Her hands were older, slower, but they still knew the language of music. Margaret opened her eyes and looked down at the keys. They weren't just ivory and ebony anymore. They were possibility. They were redemption. They were a bridge between who she'd been and who she'd become, between the dreams she'd lost and the strength she'd gained. She thought of her daughter, sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that her mother was about to reclaim a piece of herself. She thought of all the nights she'd bitten her tongue, all the disrespect she'd swallowed, all the times she'd chosen survival over pride. Tonight would be different. Margaret's fingers found the keys, and the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated through the air like silk on water. The transformation was instantaneous. Her posture straightened, years seemed to melt away, and the tired waitress disappeared, replaced by the concert pianist she'd once been. The restaurant fell into absolute silence. Her hands moved with breathtaking precision, cascading through complex passages that spoke of decades of training and natural genius. The music swelled and retreated like ocean waves, sometimes tender as a lullaby, sometimes powerful as thunder. She poured 15 years of pain, struggle, and resilience into every chord, every delicate trill. Vincent's smirk evaporated. His wine glass hung frozen midway to his lips. Margaret transitioned seamlessly into Rachmaninoff's prelude in C-sharp minor, the haunting melody filling every corner of the restaurant. Forks clattered onto plates as diners stopped eating. A woman in a corner booth began to cry. The complexity and emotion of the piece revealed not just technical mastery, but the soul of a true artist. The bass notes rumbled like distant thunder, speaking of darkness and struggle, while the treble sang out with piercing clarity, a voice crying out in the wilderness. Margaret's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed, executing passages that would challenge pianists half her age. The famous opening chords struck like hammer blows, each one reverberating through the space, commanding attention, demanding to be heard. The young couple at table 7 sat transfixed, their anniversary dinner forgotten. The man reached across the table to grip his wife's hand, both of them swept up in the emotional tide of the music. At the bar, the bartender had stopped mid-shake, the cocktail mixer dangling forgotten in his hand, ice melting as he stood mesmerized. Paolo emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the extraordinary sounds. His sous chef and 2 line cooks followed, still wearing their aprons, their faces slack with wonder. They lined up in the kitchen doorway like witnesses to a miracle, watching their colleague reveal a hidden universe of talent. The elderly woman by the window fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to capture this moment. But then she stopped, realizing that some experiences couldn't be bottled or shared, that some magic existed only in the present, unrepeatable and precious precisely because it would never come again. Margaret moved through the Rachmaninoff with devastating precision. Her injured wrist protested with sharp pains that shot up her arm, but she pushed through, channeling the hurt into the music itself. Every ache became part of the performance. Every moment of struggle transformed into art. The piece demanded everything from a pianist: technical brilliance, emotional depth, physical endurance, and she gave it all without reservation. Vincent's colleagues had gone pale. The thin man with wire-rimmed glasses set down his fork and clasped his hands together as if in prayer. The woman beside him dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. The third man, who had laughed the loudest at Vincent's cruel jokes, now stared at his lap, unable to meet anyone's gaze. As Margaret approached the climax of the piece, her playing grew even more intense. Her whole body moved with the music, swaying and leaning into the powerful chords. The piano itself seemed to come alive beneath her touch, its voice rising to fill every corner of the space, reaching into the hearts of everyone present. A waiter dropped his tray in the kitchen, the crash barely registering above the cascade of notes. No one turned to look. Every eye remained fixed on the woman at the piano, this revelation in plain clothes, this genius hidden in the uniform of service. The chandelier crystals vibrated with the resonance of the lower notes, creating tiny prisms of light that danced across the ceiling. The wine in Vincent's glass rippled in tiny concentric circles. The very air seemed to pulse with the music, as if the restaurant itself had become an instrument, amplifying Margaret's voice. She reached the final section, the notes climbing higher and higher, building toward the inevitable resolution. Her face was serene now, transported beyond the restaurant, beyond the humiliation, beyond everything except the pure expression of beauty through sound. This was why she had devoted her life to music. This was what Vincent Caldwell, with all his money and power, would never understand. The transcendent joy of creation, the sacred communion between artist and art. The final chord hung in the air, resonating, fading slowly into silence like the last light of sunset disappearing below the horizon. As the final notes resonated through the stunned silence, someone began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted in thunderous applause. People rose from their seats, offering a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. An elderly gentleman rushed forward, his face flushed with recognition. "My God, you're Margaret Shun. I saw you perform Beethoven's Emperor Concerto at Carnegie Hall in 2010. You were magnificent." The revelation rippled through the crowd. Phones appeared as people frantically searched her name. Articles materialized. The brilliant young pianist who'd vanished from the concert circuit, whose promising career had ended mysteriously at its peak. Paolo stood with his mouth open, realizing he'd had a musical legend serving breadsticks for minimum wage. Vincent remained seated, his face ashen, surrounded by his own crumpled $100 bills. The elderly gentleman, Professor David Morrison, turned to address the crowd, his voice trembling with emotion. This woman was hailed as the greatest interpreter of romantic piano literature of her generation. Critics compared her to Martha R. Garrick and Yuja Wang. She performed with the Berlin Philharmonic, the London Symphony Orchestra. He turned back to Margaret, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Where have you been? The music world has mourned your absence for 15 years. Margaret stood slowly from the piano bench, her legs unsteady. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was fading, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. She smoothed down her uniform, suddenly aware of the coffee stain on her collar, the worn fabric, the sensible shoes that had replaced the elegant heels she once wore on stage. "I had an accident," she said simply, her voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "My wrist was shattered. The surgeries, the rehabilitation, the medical bills, they took everything. And I had a daughter to raise alone." A young woman with a music notation tattoo on her forearm pushed forward, her phone still recording. "I'm a piano student at Juilliard. I wrote my dissertation on your interpretation of Liszt. Your recording of La Campanella changed my life. How are you working here? Why didn't anyone help you?" The questions came flooding in from all directions. The bartender shouted that his sister was a classical pianist who had cried when Margaret disappeared. A businessman confessed he'd purchased every one of her albums. The woman who had been crying earlier revealed she'd named her daughter after Margaret, inspired by a performance she'd attended in San Francisco. Paolo finally found his voice. "Margaret, I had no idea. All this time, you never said anything. You came in, did your work, never complained." His eyes were wet. "If I had known." "You would have what?" Margaret asked gently. "I needed a job, Paolo. You gave me one. You treated me with respect. That's more than most places offered a 62-year-old woman with a gap in her employment history." Vincent's thin colleague stood abruptly, distancing himself from the table. "I think we should go, Vincent. I have an early meeting." His voice was cold with disgust, no longer directed at Margaret, but at the man he'd been dining with. The woman beside him nodded, gathering her purse. "Yes, we really should leave." She glanced at Vincent with unmistakable contempt. "I'll be recommending to the board that we reconsider our partnership with your firm. We prefer to work with people who have character." Vincent finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know." "That's precisely the point," Professor Morrison interrupted sharply. "You didn't know, yet you felt entitled to humiliate her. You saw a waitress and assumed she had no value beyond serving your meal. You judged her worth by her occupation rather than her humanity." A food blogger who had been dining alone approached Margaret with her business card. "I have connections at Lincoln Center. They're always looking for comeback stories for their fundraising galas. Would you consider performing again? They would pay well." A tech entrepreneur in his 30s stepped forward next. "My company sponsors musicians in need. We provide grants, cover medical expenses, help artists get back on their feet. Please, let me help you. The world deserves to hear you play again." Margaret looked around at all these faces, strangers 5 minutes ago, now offering her opportunities, redemption, a path back to the life she'd lost. It was overwhelming. Part of her wanted to retreat to the safety of anonymity, to return to the simple life where she knew exactly what was expected of her. But another part of her, the part that had just awakened at that piano, refused to go back to sleep. The young couple from Table 7 approached shyly. "That was the most beautiful thing we've ever heard," the woman whispered. "We'll never forget this night. Thank you for sharing your gift with us." Vincent stood finally, his expensive suit rumpled, his face haggard. He looked like a man who had just seen his reflection clearly for the first time, and was horrified by what stared back. His $100 bills lay scattered on the table, suddenly meaningless, unable to buy back his dignity or erase his cruelty. Margaret stood slowly, her legs weak from the emotional release. She faced Vincent directly, her voice calm, but carrying undeniable strength. I played at the Royal Albert Hall, the Sydney Opera House, and yes, Carnegie Hall. I studied under Vladimir Ashkenazy. But life happened. An accident, medical debt, family responsibilities. There's no shame in honest work, Mr. Caldwell. The shame is in how you treat people you consider beneath you. Vincent opened his mouth, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in his privileged life, he felt genuinely small. Margaret picked up her apron, then paused. Keep your money. That performance was a gift for me. It reminded me of who I still am inside. As she walked toward the kitchen, the restaurant erupted in applause again. Vincent sat alone at his table, his friends having quietly distanced themselves, forced to confront the ugly truth of his own prejudice. Sometimes the people we dismiss are carrying more grace, talent, and dignity than we could ever possess. Professor Morrison followed Margaret toward the kitchen, his voice urgent but respectful. Please, Miss Chun, before you go, I teach at the Manhattan School of Music now. We have a fellowship program for established artists who want to mentor the next generation. The compensation is substantial, and it would give you access to practice facilities, recording studios. You wouldn't have to perform if you're not ready, but you could share your knowledge, your artistry. Margaret paused at the kitchen door, her hand resting on the frame. She looked back at the restaurant, at all these people whose evening had been transformed by an unexpected moment of beauty. The young Juilliard student was still filming, tears running down her face. The couple holding hands looked at each other with renewed wonder, as if Margaret's music had reminded them why they'd fallen in love in the first place. I have a daughter, Margaret said softly. She's in her second year of medical school. I work double shifts to help with her expenses. She doesn't know about my past. I never wanted her to feel the weight of what I'd lost, or to think she was the reason I'd given it up. She could be proud instead, the tech entrepreneur interjected, stepping closer. Proud that her mother sacrificed for her and still managed to retain such extraordinary gifts. My foundation could establish a scholarship in your name at her medical school. We could ensure she finishes her education debt-free, and you could return to music without guilt. Paolo approached, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. Margaret, you've been the best employee I've ever had. You're punctual, kind to customers. Well, most customers, and you've trained half my current staff. But this, he gestured toward the piano, this is who you really are. If you decide to leave, you leave with my blessing and my deepest gratitude. And if you want to stay while you figure things out, you always have a place here. A well-dressed woman in her 50s made her way through the crowd. I'm Sarah Rothstein, Director of Programming for the New York Philharmonic. I was having dinner at the bar when you played. Ms. Chun, we're planning a special concert series next season called Resilience, featuring artists who've overcome adversity. The fee for a single performance would be more than you make here in 2 years. Please consider it. Margaret felt the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crumble. For 15 years, she'd kept her past locked away, told herself that chapter was closed, convinced herself she was content with survival. But standing here now, surrounded by people who recognized her worth, who wanted to help her reclaim what she'd lost, she realized how much of herself she'd buried along with her career. Vincent finally stood, his movements mechanical. He looked at Margaret one last time, and she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not just shame, but a dawning realization of how hollow his own existence had become. He'd built his empire on crushing others, on asserting dominance, on measuring worth by bank accounts and social status. And in 3 minutes of music, this woman he'd tried to humiliate had revealed the poverty of his soul. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. Margaret nodded slightly, acknowledging but not absolving. Some apologies couldn't erase the harm that came before them. Vincent gathered his belongings and walked toward the exit, his posture defeated. His former colleagues didn't follow. They remained at the table, unable to look at him, finally seeing the ugliness they'd been complicit in for years. The food blogger approached Margaret again, this time with a gentle smile. "I'm going to write about this. Not just the performance, but the whole story. How talent can be hidden anywhere. How we never know what struggles people are carrying. How one moment of courage can change everything. Is that okay?" Margaret considered this. Once her story was out there, her quiet life would end. Her daughter would learn the truth. The world that had forgotten her would remember. There would be interviews, requests, expectations. The simple anonymity she'd wrapped around herself like armor would dissolve. But maybe that armor had become a prison. "Yes," Margaret said finally. "Tell the story. All of it. The glory and the fall, the struggle and tonight. Maybe it will remind someone else that it's never too late to reclaim yourself." The young Juilliard student stepped forward shyly. "Could I hug you? You've been my hero since I was 12 years old." Margaret opened her arms, and the girl embraced her, sobbing. "I almost quit last month," the student confessed. "The pressure, the competition, the fear of failure, it felt like too much. But seeing you tonight, knowing you survived losing everything and still kept the music alive inside you, it changes everything. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.